I want to welcome you to this year's Boundaries training. This is something we agreed to do together once every 4 years when we as an annual conference approved the highest ideals about 8 years ago. And so I look forward to our time together. I'm speaking to the group in the northern part of the state who's gathered for the Boundaries training, but also this is being videotaped, and this videotape is going to be shown to the pastors who are gathered in other parts of the state, so I welcome them as well. I hope this time proves to be helpful and a time of learning and growth and personal insight. And I think this time is important, and it deals with a topic that is critical for us as we seek to live out those highest ideals that come with our calling and our ministry in Christ's name. So welcome, and I hope this is a good experience for us. I've been asked by the leaders of this to say a few words about boundaries, and that notion of boundaries is an intentionally broad term. So boundaries draws our attention to everything from sexual harassment and sexual misconduct to pornography and how we relate to our colleagues, how we relate to those who serve the church before we got there. It relates to all kinds of control issues and shame issues, financial issues. You could take that boundaries, and it's kind of intentionally broad for that reason. But as we gather here, I want to take a few minutes and to walk with you down a path of, I think, one of the more harmful aspects of the boundaries conversation. And I'm going to be very down to earth. Some of this gets a little creepy, I have to admit, when I get into some of these details. But I want to spend some time just visiting about one particular notion of this boundaries conversation, and that's about sexual misconduct. Now, when I say that, I'm not talking about sexual predators, which in my experience are actually extraordinarily rare in pastoral ministry. Sexual predators are those who, their only purpose for being in ministry is to gain access to vulnerable people. And that's a pretty rare breed, and that's what we hope to address through some of our safe sanctuaries and issues like that. But instead I want to turn this to the boundary issue of misconduct, of having an affair, of developing an inappropriate affection that leads to inappropriate contact, most likely with one of our own church members. Now, I want you to picture in your mind the pastor, a pastor who's committed to Christ, who loves the church, loves his or her family, wants nothing but the best for them, wants nothing but the best for their members and for the Church of Jesus Christ. This pastor doesn't wake up one day and say, gee, today I think I'm going to destroy my career, surrender my credentials, wreck my family, destroy a family in the church, and do immeasurable harm to the local church and to the annual conference, and rob countless people of their trust and faith in Jesus Christ. No one wakes up and says that to himself or herself, right? Yet somehow that happens. It is easy for us to draw a line and push pastors who exhibit those behaviors on the other side of the line and say, there's the bad pastors and here we are, the good pastors, right? And there are those who are capable of this kind of thing, and then there are those of us over here who love Jesus who, of course, would never do that sort of thing. But that's a dangerous kind of self-righteousness that blinds us to our own vulnerabilities and blinds us to our own interior life and what's going on inside of us. When I talk about clergy misconduct, I got to say that I'm not here to scold anyone. I'm not your daddy. I could shake my fist and jump up and down and act angry, and if I thought it would do any good, but it wouldn't do any good. And that's not the way I want to relate to you. It's not the way I want you relating to me. I'm here because we're on a common journey. We've been on this journey together for 8 years in this conference. We've got at least, I guess we got 4 years to go. And that requires us to hold each other to an extraordinary mutual accountability to preserve the witness and trust and faith, the treasure that's been placed in earthen vessels. We hold each other accountable to the highest ideals. I've been involved with clergy self-care issues for my whole ministry. Some of you may not realize this, but my earliest books were written when I was in my 20s, and it was about clergy self-care issues. So I've taught and written and done retreats and held conversations. I served 12 years on the Board of Ordained Ministry and in my home conference. and as part of that had the unenviable task of meeting with several people who faced misconduct charges, and also visited with many of them following their removal from ministry in a pastoral relationship. And I've also had the unfortunate task in this role of removing some of your colleagues from ministry. And so this all has just kind of created in me this curiosity and this desire to know, how does this happen? How does this come about? If pastors don't wake up one day and decide that, okay, today's the day I'm going to ruin my career and destroy a family in this church and destroy my own family and bring immeasurable harm to the congregation, if it doesn't happen that way, how does it happen? I'm going to borrow some insights from Roy Oswald of the Alban Institute, an article he wrote one time called Signs of Vulnerability, and also borrow from another article by Raymond Brock and Horace Lukens, Affair Prevention and Ministry, from the Journal of Psychology and Christianity. And they offer some good insights that match my own experience in working with pastors over the years. The move into infidelity in the pastoral role is subtle, and it's a little creepy, but there are some notable signs of vulnerability and experience. And what are those signs? Pastors whose sense of self is entirely caught up in their work, and whose sense of self is especially tied to the positive feedback they get from their congregation. Pastors, did you hear that? Whose entire identity is caught up in their work and who have an extraordinary desire to please and not face disappointment in their congregation. I think I've described about 90% of United Methodist pastors in that, by the way. And so one of the contexts is when you have this kind of pastor who then is facing resistance or criticism or disappointment, who begins to feel underappreciated because their kind of source of love and self-identity is tied up in that. So that's one of the marks. The second is pastors who have not learned to live well with loneliness. Well, that sounds like a strange statement, doesn't it? But the pastoral role brings with it a certain element of loneliness. We relate to the congregation, we relate to the community in a way that is very distinctive and is very difficult to find others who would understand what it's like to be us. Okay? And pastors have a hard time, many times, forming deep relationships and cannot name someone with whom they can share virtually anything in confidence. I mean, can you name one person, two people, that you really could say what's on your heart of hearts, what your highest hopes and deepest fears are, what's really going on? Another characteristic is pastors who have the habit of pouring themselves fully into their work, working longer hours, and then the interesting thing is this loop that gets started as they pour more work into their more time into their work. There's a growing criticism from their distance at home, and so there are more late nights, more distance from home, not enough time with the family, eventually working late and kind of creating a distance between spouse and children and so forth. And that often leads to a kind of criticism loop that reinforces being away. It's more comfortable to just do God's work out there than to face the discomfort of our sense of neglect or the guilt that we feel about that. Failing to maintain personal devotional time other than sermon preparation. I think that's a professional hazard for every one of us, is that we only search the Scripture for a sermon or for a leadership need rather than for our own personal devotional life. The need for excitement of public exposure, being in the limelight, and how this dynamic creates that the responses of the congregation begin to we try and get that to compensate for our lack of personal or family fulfillment. Another pattern, this gets into behaviors, making calls on the way home or having unpredictable arrival times, beginning to miss dinner, and then when pastors start to take days off and spending those days entirely without their spouse if they're married, That's an interesting sign, isn't it? Again, it's a professional hazard because many of us have spouses whose days off are our work days. But if we're not careful, it creates a kind of divergent use of time, and if we fail to nurture those significant relationships. And then one seeking social and intellectual stimulation outside one's marriage. Now picture that as kind of the background that we're describing here. You know, that trouble dealing with isolation, feeling underappreciated by the congregation, a sense of self all tied up in the work, and so dealing with the criticism there, dealing with the criticism at home, maybe because you're spending more time at work. I mean, see the dynamic that's starting to work, and then put into that mix the entry of someone into the picture who does not criticize, but who thinks you are great, and who you are a wonderful listener, unlike his her husband or his wife, someone who flatters you, someone who compliments you, someone that you look forward to being around, someone who seems to be lacking all the same things you lack and provide many of the things that you want. And so you start having this contrast between flattery and criticism, between feeling underappreciated and feeling extraordinarily overappreciated. You can just see the where this is going. At home, one of the marks is when pastors who drink alcohol, not all pastors do, some pastors do, but pastors who drink alcohol, suddenly, sometimes that moves from moving a single glass of wine before going to bed to having 3 or 4 just to go to sleep, and starting to go to bed at a different time than his or her spouse, and you just see the dynamic taking place there. And then there are other compulsive habits that may develop. Killing time on the computer alone, searching websites that you wouldn't want others to know about, setting up private email addresses that the spouse does not have access to, exchange of emails in private, exchange of cell phone numbers that are not required for professional reasons, finding oneself fantasizing after another woman or man, beginning to dream about a colleague or beginning to dream about a counselee. And now I told you this was going to get creepy, but this is actually, as I've sat down and actually had conversations with folks like, what happened next? What happened? One of it, in many cases, was starting to drive by the house of the person who thinks you're so wonderful and thinks you're such a good listener. And at first you don't stop, and then maybe you begin to think, well, it doesn't hurt to stop. Just say hello. And there should be bells going off at this time, of course, because there's trouble ahead. And you mix into that kind of this constant low-grade depression, ambiguous feelings about the call to ministry, and this feeling of looking forward to counseling with a particular person, working with a particular person, looking forward to it because how it makes you feel, desiring time alone with them, driving to and from events or working on things alone with them around the church. This is subtle, but it was interesting to me, is people who've been down this road say they find themselves starting to dress differently or move things around in their office differently before the person comes to visit them. Hugs that last a little too long, the warning bells stop going off, or the person begins to turn the warning bells off. I mean, just saying. One of the most fascinating things to me is, as someone moves down that road, is that these habits and practices that bring one to the point of vulnerability, they bring someone to a point of vulnerability where somehow they begin to think that this relationship is strangely helpful, practical, and almost natural. And they become blind to the risk and the consequences and the damage to the other person or to themselves. They start bending reality. And I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who, even after everything has exploded, in their heart of hearts, they're justifying this like something that was good about this. It's like, well, quoting from Oswald and some of these other articles, so there's just some advice I would offer. Refuse to meet with parishioners in circumstances that could be misread by them or others. You know, have no secretive meetings with anyone. I simply cannot imagine a pastoral responsibility that would cause you to go to a place that you would be unwilling to talk about or have your spouse with your spouse or have your spouse present. I can't imagine what responsibility that would be that requires that level of secrecy from those we love and trust. Make it clear that you do not do long-term counseling with individuals. You know, there are 1,000 active and retired clergy related to the Missouri Conference. And I would guess that there are no more than 6 in that 1,000 who actually have the professional credentials to see someone for more than 4 counseling sessions. And if you're seeing somebody for more than 4 counseling sessions, I'd ask you to reflect upon, is that meeting your needs or their needs? Are you doing it because of the lift it gives you? If so, you're beginning to abuse the authority of your office. Take seriously the boundaries training, the safe sanctuary, and these conversations here. I got to say this. One of the most offensive statements you can make to me is that all this stuff that we do today is nonsense, or just driven by liability issues, or just a matter of political correctness of some sort. Real people get hurt when we get set adrift in these ways. We do real harm to parishioners. Clergy families are destroyed, and churches take generations to heal. So I invite you to participate willingly and openly, as if you desire to know and to learn how to protect yourself and how to protect others and the church you love. Now, if you're unhappy with the quality of today's presentation, I mean, we can redo it. We can do it differently 4 years from now. There are lots of things we could change and all. We want to make this the best. This is your workshop. This is part of our common agreement. But whether we have it or not is not really in question. It is something that we have to be willing to engage. And I would say this: it is just clearly a mistake. It is clearly a mistake to believe that all this conversation is about other people or about bad pastors, about them. To take that attitude is to be marked by a kind of spiritual pride, a blindness that is unbecoming to pastoral ministry. It's to demonstrate a kind of spiritual naivete that I think is dangerous. As far as spiritual and self-care, I would just ask you, not only today, but throughout your ministry, from time to time, just search your own heart with prayer and great honesty. Misconduct, and infidelity, these require a kind of deception. They require us deceiving our spouse. They require us deceiving the church. But the first person who is deceived, in any case I've ever seen, is the self. And so don't get in that trap. Don't deceive yourself into thinking this is all about somebody else. Pay more attention to your primary relationships, spouse, friends, kids. You got to balance your schedule in a way that feeds your life. You've got to have a life outside of pastoral ministry. So there's no sense that your salvation rests on how people feel about you in your local congregation. Surround yourself with support. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, as the scripture says, for God is at work in you. You know, I think there's a reason Jesus sent the disciples out 2 by 2 in pairs. It's worded different ways in each gospel. But in that community there was created a mutual accountability. I've often wondered, what did those folks talk about as they were going to a place of ministry that they'd never been before, with a message they'd never that was new to them, to a people that they knew were hostile. And I mean, they had to talk each other into it, right? You know, they had to, you know, what's going to happen if this happens? Don't worry, I'll be praying for you. I'll be right behind you. You know. But what did those two talk about when they left a point of ministry? I can't believe you said that. I saw the way you were looking at her. You know, we got to talk, right? There was a mutual accountability that came in the closeness of ministry in the community of pastors. So surround yourself with support. I think we as a conference and as leaders of the church have an absolute obligation to get this right. For the safety of our people, for the good of our churches, for the health of our pastors and their families, for the ministry of the conference, for the ministry of Jesus Christ. And so if you find yourself in any of the descriptions I've given you or any of the things that you hear or read about today, you know, don't walk away from it. Engage it. Talk with somebody. Clergy colleague, counselor, therapist, your own spouse. Take the steps that lead to health. Well, I'm glad you're here today, and my hope and prayer is that each of us gains at least one new insight, one new helpful practice, one encouraging reminder of our common calling as all of us seek to live out the highest ideals. Thank you and God bless you. And as always, it's a privilege to serve as your bishop, and I look forward to learning with you today as we're a part of this year's Boundaries Seminar. Thank you and God bless you.